This one's last, but I watched 26.
There. All right, we're going to call this meeting to order. The House Energy, Utilities, and Telecommunications Committee is called to order. Gabe, do you mind leading us in a prayer? You're a good prayer. Okay.
Let us pray. Dear God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this meeting. We ask that you guide our chair and that you guide all the speakers, and that we have a great meeting, and a short one for that matter. This we pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. I feel the power coming through me to have a quick meeting. Wow. All right. Primarily, I'm trying to see who's here. I had said in the chamber today, anybody has a resolution or a bill, they can come and give a short presentation, to what it is, but I don't see anybody here, so we're going to go ahead and go to the main reason I'm having the meeting today. Jessica Simmons is here, and she's going to give us, and some providers are here also, going to give us some updates on where we stand with broadband in the state. And I know Jessica has information. She's the person who has the information, and but particularly about funding and some of this funding streams that have been coming from the federal government. So, if you would come and tell us what you know, and if you talk slow enough that my ears can keep up with your words, I'd appreciate it. Sometimes you go a little bit faster than I.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for the opportunity. Let's see, make sure this is on. An opportunity to do a broadband update. We feel like we've made really good progress over the last year, and so I'd love to tell you more about what we're working on, and then obviously what we have coming up, which is quite a lot this year. So with that, I generally always like to start all of my presentations out with kind of the latest version of our state broadband availability map, which you can see up on the screen here. The great news is seeing so many different colors all blended together. I know that becomes a very busy map, but it's great when you see all of those colors, because what they represent is all sorts of various funding streams that are being braided together to provide service throughout our state. And so one of the things we're also very proud of this year is, we continue to obviously get more data and evolve with our broadband availability map. And so again, it's a very interactive map. So if you go to broadband.georgia.gov, you can obviously manipulate the map. We're also mapping we have a lot more data that we can publicly share now. And so we're able to actually show different speed tiers and availability, in addition to obviously unserved and underserved the way that we have done in the past. And with this particular picture, we also have the grant layer on, where you can see kind of in my very small legend there, all of the various funding sources that are currently in flight before we get to our BEAD program. But again, we are so lucky to have such great resources to be able to map this data. It's been very useful for us to make sure that we're able to strategically allocate money to the areas that need it the most. And then obviously we'll be talking about the BEAD program today, which we are currently implementing, and so far early in that process, but feel that we're going to get really good results from that grant. So quickly before we talk about BEAD, just wanted to provide a quick update to the committee. Obviously, Governor Kemp back in February of 2022 allocated over $400 million in state fiscal recovery funds for broadband expansion throughout the state. To get to just over 175,000 unserved and underserved locations. And so this is a slide that the committee has definitely seen before, but what I wanted to update everyone on is just a reminder that all of these projects must be complete by the end of 2026. And you can see, based on Governor Kemp's award of just over $414 million, thus far, for these broadband infrastructure projects, just over $254 million has been dispersed through this program to the awardees for the program, to represent just over 60% of the allocated money has been dispersed. We feel very comfortable right now where we stand with the projects that are being funded through this particular funding source, given obviously when Governor Kemp made those awards and then obviously the 2026 deadline. We have seen a number of projects now that have finished that are completely done, and then there's a lot of projects that are scheduled to finish in 2025. So we expect that we'll see the vast remainder of this funding actually going out this year, which is some kind of remainder kind of follow-up payments in 2026. But again, I'd expect to see the vast majority of this continue to go out in 2025. We also have awards with obviously bigger and smaller providers. And some of the larger providers I know through our conversations and monitoring are also waiting to submit some of their reimbursements closer to the end when they're just kind of done with all of their projects. So that's also why we see that a lot of the funding is probably going to end up being dispersed this year. Just also a really quick update on our Capital Projects Fund, which was our second grant that Governor Kemp announced in January and June of 2023. That was just over $246 million. And so far, just over $20 million has been drawn down. Again, we feel comfortable where we are just based on the timing of those programs and when the timelines of those builds are supposed to be done. We believe that we're going to see a really drastic ramp up in funds being requested from this program. Just as a reminder, obviously, for the committee, so anything that's funded through the American Rescue Plan Act with state fiscal recovery funds, obviously the state received that money, OPB received that money in 2 tranches. So the state does hold that money. And then for Capital Projects Fund, even though it's within the American Rescue Plan Act, that does work differently. U.S. Treasury does hold that funding, and so that is something that each time an awardee would submit a reimbursement request to OPB, or GTA, my organization, would submit a reimbursement request to OPB for our administrative work. They do have to draw that down from U.S. Treasury. Sure. So State Fiscal Recovery Fund, the state holds that money based on the 2 tranches it received of ARPA funding. And so even if there is any potential kind of pause or delay in any of the programs, the state already holds that funding. For Capital Projects Fund, though, which is our $246 million grant, Treasury does hold that funding. U.S. Treasury holds that funding. And so that is something that each time we have an awardee that has an eligible reimbursement, we do have to draw down that funding. Working with OPB, though, over the last couple of weeks, we have been able to continue to draw down funding. And we also don't foresee that this program is going to be impacted and will continue on, we believe, without delay. And next, obviously, the big thing that we really wanted to address today is the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. It's the BEAD program within the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021. It's a $42.5 billion program to expand high-speed internet access throughout the country. Georgia found out our allotment in June of 2023, where we're receiving just over $1.3 billion. And we have access at this point, and have since 2022, to just under $5 million for our planning and operations and office support. Kind of talking more about the timeline of BEAD. So initially when this legislation was signed in 2021. 2022 was really honestly a really big mapping year because a lot of this program was dependent on the FCC standing up their own location level map. So essentially the federal government standing up what we had already for a number of years here in Georgia, but obviously on a larger national scale. And that did take them some time and then took kind of multiple iterations to kind of quality check the map. And then obviously that's still something that states and providers continue to work with today. So our grant, we did receive final approval of our initial proposal volume 2, which is just the federal name that was given to essentially our state grant plan. So we received that in September of last year, and we launched round 1 of our grant in December and just actually closed it the last week of January. Based on that timeline, we are now just starting our assessment and starting curing with applicants for the applications that were received. But I will say, and obviously since we're in an open grant round, I can't share a lot of information since we are still in our scoring phase. But we had an incredible response to our first round for the grant. We believe that we're going to be able to cover a vast number of the locations that are eligible based on round 1. And at this point, depending on how our negotiations look, we'll talk about that in a minute, maybe a small subset of locations that might move to a round 2. With that being said, unlike our previous programs where Governor Kemp had the ability to make award announcements and then we could just move forward, we have to submit a final proposal to NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, and get their approval before we can move forward. So that being said, we're expecting this fall, certainly sooner if we can, but certainly by this fall we'll be submitting our final proposal, which essentially what that is that's just our slate of selected grant awardees to get to the remaining locations. And then at that point, once we get approval, then we can actually hit the ground running with the grant. Just some quick numbers, which we're very pleased about, is that based on the FCC's National Broadband Availability Map, and then also going through a very comprehensive challenge process with the providers, many in the room, to make sure that we're not stepping on locations that are already served or have plans to be served by the end of 2025. And obviously, we've got very good data about other enforceable funding commitments, as you can see on the map. After going through a rigorous process to make sure that we were targeting just the truly unserved and underserved locations to be eligible for this program, ultimately, the result of that, which is our kind of official B data set, is 71,776 eligible unserved locations in the state and 93,298 underserved locations. And the only difference between an unserved and an underserved location is just what speed they currently have access to. So out of our essentially eligible data set, we have roughly about 165,000 locations that are eligible for our $1.3 billion allocation. Over the last couple of years, since June of 2023, I've been very careful to say that obviously to see if ultimately our allocation is going to be enough to get to the remaining identified unserved and underserved locations in the state. However, I will say based on just, a preliminary review of our applications from round 1, at this point, we can say with pretty good confidence that we're certainly going to have enough funding to get to all of the identified unserved and underserved locations that remain. So we're very encouraged by that. And obviously, we'll keep you updated throughout that process as there's more data that we can make public based on the success of our various rounds for the competitive process for awarding this money. But where we stand today is obviously we're through phase 1 where applicants have applied. We're currently in phase 2, we're currently scoring the applications. And then unlike our previous programs, they're kind of 3 and 4 here just to kind of highlight for y'all, where we will be setting, based on federal rules, something called the extreme high cost per location threshold. So essentially, obviously we want to make sure that we get high-speed access to all unserved and underserved locations in the state. However, we also want to make sure we're being good stewards of the funding available, and to some extent, obviously the data would show that our cost modeling would show, but then also kind of backed up by providers as well, that there are some locations that it's just not really financially feasible to serve those locations with fiber. And so at that point, that's where we essentially look at our data and figure out what is a reasonable dollar amount where it makes sense for us to look at alternative technologies so that we're being good stewards of this funding, to try to certainly use this funding to put in the most kind of lasting, resilient infrastructure possible, but where we're also not funding individual locations that are really, frankly, an inappropriate level of investment that would be needed by the state to get there. And so that's also where we're very much going to be using the negotiation phase of the BEAD program. Previously in our grants, obviously, we would accept applications and sometimes make minor tweaks, but generally move forward with what was proposed. Because with the BEAD program, we have a program requirement to get to all of the remaining unserved and underserved locations, we feel like this negotiation phase is going to be incredibly important so that we can negotiate with the applicants to make sure that we are picking up as many locations as possible before we look to our round 2 and we start looking at other technologies. And then again, we have to submit all of this to NTIA for approval. And then once we receive that approval, we can move forward with the award agreements that will be between OPB and the awarded ISPs. And then with that, they can go ahead and get started. One thing I wanted to highlight very quickly, want to be respectful of everybody's time, is just, with the change of administration, we do feel like there could be some changes to the program. Obviously a lot of it is just speculation at this point, because the Secretary of Commerce has not been confirmed yet by the Senate. However, a lot of the things that we're generally hearing that are being talked about, again, we can't obviously confirm what the changes are going to be until we get direction from NTIA. But we do feel like one of the things about the program that everybody, I think, all collectively would agree on is we want to see it moving faster. This was something that was signed in 2021, and like our previous programs, we were able to move very quickly and get the money awarded and get shovels in the ground. And so I think that we have the opportunity here that some of these projects could start moving faster. So some of the things that have been talked about are just ways to streamline permitting. Previously, for the grants that are currently in flight, NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, has been waived. It is currently not waived for the BEAD program, and that is a pretty lengthy federal process. And so there is already a good bit of talk that NEPA could potentially be waived to kind of speed up getting providers building. Also, some other potential waivers. I think at least a lot of the states would hope, rather than maybe coming in and having to amend our plans that are already approved, that there might be a waiver process so that certain kind of provisions could potentially be waived, that could also allow us to kind of keep moving and start moving even faster. And then also, potential changes to technology preferences. However, everything that the state has done thus far has been very focused on fiber deployments, and thus far our BEAD program is as well. And then potential changes to a low-cost service option, which could also maybe come through a waiver process as well. But so just wanted to highlight those for you of some potential changes that we're seeing. But everything that we're generally hearing that they're talking about right now all seems to be, from a policy perspective, ways to get the money allocated and get companies building faster to obviously get people served faster. The last thing I wanted to highlight is the state also is receiving $22.5 million for the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant, which was also within the IIJA in the Digital Equity Act. It's the State Digital Equity Capacity Grant. So essentially, it's going to be more focused, while BEAD is more focused on the infrastructure side of actually the deployment of, fiber and, the actual kind of infrastructure to promote connectivity. This is more focused on adoption and digital skills and devices and education. And so this is something that, as of right now, this money has been allocated to the state of Georgia, but it's still in kind of very early stages here. And at this point, we're essentially waiting on federal guidance to figure out our next steps. So with that, just wanted to run through kind of a brief overview of kind of where we stand, obviously, with the current programs, the current funding, where we stand kind of right now in round one of our competitive process for allocating our BEAD funds. And this is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me at any time, but also would be happy to answer any questions that you and the committee may have.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Questions from the committee? Who is that? Yes, sir. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I just have two quick questions. The first one, you mentioned a website at the beginning. I don't think I caught all of that. What was that website?
Yep. It's broadband.georgia.gov.
Broadband.georgia.gov.
And that's where we have all sorts of resources related to all of the grants we're currently implementing. And then that's also where you would get to the broadband availability map.
Okay. And just the second question, Mr. Chairman. So what makes an area not suitable for funding?
So essentially, the BEAD grant, the way that we look at it, and all of our previous grants have been if the level of service that's there. If something is completely served, it's not eligible for funding because it already has service at a particular speed level. However, you'll see based on our BEAD program, essentially most of the entire state is eligible. It just depends on if that county has unserved or underserved locations. For example, there's over, I believe, without my numbers in front of me, over 2,000 locations, even within Fulton County, that are BEAD eligible, just for the fact that, based on the speed tier and based on our data, this is something that, a lot of times the grants do go to rural areas, sometimes because they have more unserved locations, but especially with the BEAD program, we are targeting any unserved and underserved locations. And so almost every county in the state of Georgia had BEAD eligible locations. And the only thing that would essentially make an area ineligible for funding is if they are completely served already, or if there's an enforceable funding commitment to serve that location. So for example, if there's another state or federal grant that would have covered the entire area, because obviously we don't want to apply duplicative funding.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Questions? Well, I have a few. I've got a bunch of them. I'm going to limit it because they've got, the providers are going to speak too, so I want to make sure they get a
Yes,
chance.
sir.
But I want to ask on the mapping. As
Yes, sir.
I'm just happen to recall when that came up a year ago, 2 years ago, whatever. I remember there was a discussion about, for that program, they wanted to use a mapping that was being developed by, I guess, by some government agency. I don't know which one.
The FCC.
Who?
It's the FCC. So
The FCC.
Unfortunately, initially we were told in the program, and this did kind of change throughout time. Initially we were told that states could use their own maps.
Could or could not. Could not, right.
And then we were told later on that we could not. They wanted to create more uniformity.
Right.
And so everybody had to, based on the eligibility of locations, everybody at NTI's direction had to use the FCC's National Broadband Availability Map.
Did that change it considerably from what we have? Our mapping?
So yes and no. It's definitely been a process of kind of getting there, just because we use different vendors initially for kind of the underlying address set. And so kind of trying to find kind of commonality between those two data sets was not as alike as you would generally expect address information to be. But I do think that the federal map has come a very long way. They have done multiple iterations. It's constantly being updated. And so I think that we are certainly much, much closer based on the quality of the data. But ultimately, in order to receive the funding and to implement the program, we had to use the federal map for this program.
Now, BEAD stands for what?
Broadband equity, access, and deployment.
Okay, so I'm assuming from that there, with that money, there's preferences for where the money goes. Is that correct or not correct? Preferences regarding the equity part of that BEAD?
Based on the legislation, how it's written, it's a tiered structure that we have to use the money to get to all unserved locations, then underserved locations, then community anchor institutions that were identified through the process that don't have access to a gig symmetrical service. And then after that, there are various what they deem as non-deployment uses of any excess funding, where that is something that we're still looking at what those potential deployment uses might be, just for the fact that until we finalize our grant rounds, we're not going to know if we have non-deployment funds. At this point, we believe that we will. But the legislation is very clear that the money has to go out in a structured way to unserved locations, underserved, and then community anchor institutions specifically for connectivity.
What was the last one you said?
Community anchor institutions.
Community what?
Community anchor institutions for connectivity. So like a rec, a rec center, a hospital, anything that serves kind of the broad community, but it also has to be based on, it can't just be something you would think of as like a community center. It has to be somewhere that also promotes connectivity or adoption.
Okay.
But so like if somebody, a library, a lot of the libraries are already served through the E-rate program. But again, if it's something that has, large community support, a computer lab, but the legislation is very structured of how the money has to go out first. And then right now, based on federal rules, but not within the IIJA, there is a heavy preference for fiber deployment, and that is something that we're still awaiting guidance on to see if that stays.
Okay, well, unserved and underserved, I completely get that. So tell me again what would be considered underserved?
So an unserved location.
Underserved.
Yes, sir. So an underserved location is, they have basic levels of service, so they at least meet the 25/3 threshold, so
Right.
25 megabits in the download and 3 in the upload,
Right.
but they don't exceed 100/20. So essentially, they're in this gap where your lack of service is not kind of at the speed tier where you would be considered unserved,
Yeah.
but you don't have any better than 100/20. And so it's really those locations kind of in that delta
Yeah.
where making sure that obviously, as technology evolves and as, usage demand goes up, making sure that that availability is there at higher levels.
Right. I understand it. 25.3 though that's good enough for just about anybody, really.
It's definitely something that, that's still obviously what our state law is of service defined at 25/3. But, obviously just as we prepare for technology to evolve, more demand on networks with more and more devices connecting, it is something that at least the availability of increased speeds, I think
That's where, if I
will.
were the emperor, I would say, no, stop at 25 and don't spend any more money on going beyond that. I think in my house, we just went beyond 25.3 recently. And it was only because of grandson using some kind of gaming. That's the only reason. Anyway, I'm not the emperor, I'm not the king, I'm not much of anything. But okay, thank you. Just a couple more. I know
Yes,
that
sir, of course.
I don't see any other questions right now, but you had mentioned alternative technology in some places. What is that alternative technology?
So right now in NTI's Notice of Funding Opportunity, it clarifies what they deem, again, there's a fiber preference, but then they deem essentially other reliable broadband, and that is a terrestrial broadband, so that would be coax, licensed fixed wireless, but it does not consider unlicensed fixed wireless or satellite service currently to be reliable technology.
Okay.
And so right now there's a classification with NTIA that I think is very possible could change, where right now it looks at reliable technology as hybrid fiber coax, coaxial cable, licensed fixed wireless is some of the alternatives we can look at that they still deem reliable. But then there's another category where they deem them alternative, and that's unlicensed fixed wireless and satellite. Ultimately, we believe that it's going to take take kind of a hybrid approach of all of those technologies to get to some of our obviously hardest to reach locations. But again, based on what Governor Kemp has already been able to do through the $660 million of grants currently in flight, along with an incredibly robust showing in our round one of the grant that we're currently scoring right now. We believe that, again, we're going to have to use alternative technologies to get us to that 100% mark.
Yeah.
But we're trying to deploy the most future-proof, most reliable technology, as far as we possibly can, and then look at alternatives really for those very unique outliers
Right.
where they are, $100,000, $200,000 per passing.
And I'm just going one more. I think somebody else has a question, but I did want to ask you. You admit this. Y'all have to submit a plan to somebody. Who is that organization? What is that organization?
It's the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, so NTIA. It's a subset of the Department of Commerce.
Has that been around for a while, or is that something just kind of been developed?
It has been around for a while. I might phone a friend here in the room if they can tell me exactly when it was
I'm just
created,
curious.
but it has an established federal agency that's been around for multiple administrations at this point.
Okay.
They have done other broadband mapping activities in the past. They have direct grants that they've made on their own. And so, they have other grants that are actually not where they're working with the states, but also working directly with awardees as well.
Okay.
So it is not a particularly new office, but I can certainly follow up with you of the year it was created.
Well, I appreciate you coming. Did you have a question?
Yeah, if you got a minute.
Yeah, well,
It's along the lines you're asking, really, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for this presentation. A lot of great information. And Mr. Chairman, I wonder how many years ago we had a joint Senate House study committee
About
looking.
8 or 9 years ago now.
Yeah, and it was no light at the end of the tunnel, no federal funding, no state funding, and I never thought we'd be this far this quick. And I know some people are impatient on it. So my question is, looking at the funding levels committed now, how far will that get us? When will we see it, possibly the light at the end of the tunnel when you got them all, everybody connected? Have you got any kind of ballpark estimation?
Sure. So we have a lot of locations in flight right now between the two programs Governor Kemp has already funded. While I mentioned it was $660 million roughly that we have in flight right now, we received incredible provider matches based on those programs. And so based on what Governor Kemp did, along with what the private sector was willing to put in as well, we actually have $1.2 billion in flight right now before we even look at our $1.3 billion BEAD allocation. And so that being said, the current programs that are in flight right now have to be built by the end of 2026. A number of those projects are already done or scheduled to be done certainly before that 26 deadline. With the BEAD program, which we do feel is going to be sufficient to get to the remaining, and I will qualify with this, the remaining identified unserved and underserved locations, because one thing that we will try to bring up and continue to try to bring up to NTIA, is the way they've structured the program. If new locations appear in the map, we cannot add them at this point, but we're going to, hopefully maybe see if that's a change that can be made. But with the 165,000 remaining that essentially don't meet the speed tiers, but then also don't have an enforceable funding commitment to serve them, providers, if they accept BEAD funding, have 4 years, up to 4 years, to build to those locations. However, something that we've accepted in our application is obviously a project timeline, and a lot of those projects are certainly not slated to take all 4 years. And so it's very possible that once we're able to get through our competitive process, get an approved final proposal, and hopefully maybe with some streamlining of some permitting, get shovels in the ground, that hopefully it shouldn't be that much longer. But at this point, given the 4-year timeline of the program, when final proposal could be approved, a rough estimate, probably about 2030 or sooner.
I think we got another question popped up here. Which one's first?
Yes, you go first.
Mary Frances?
Thank you for your presentation. Lots of great information. So you mentioned two funding sources, ARPA Capital Projects Fund, $246 million left, I think. And then you also mentioned the BEAD Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. You said that the U.S. Treasury holds the $246 million, but it's not impacted. And then I forget how much the BEAD money is, but
1.3 billion.
1.3 billion. So given the cuts at the federal level and the freezes, can you, especially at the U.S. Treasury, can you? You said you don't think the ARPA funds are going to be impacted. But it's really hard to tell from what's being frozen and what's been cut. What is your feeling about whether or not these funds are actually going to be available for Georgia to follow through with these plans?
Obviously, like everybody else, we continue to obviously, assess the landscape. And, we've seen with other programs, we've had to pivot based on changes in federal guidance. And so I think we're well poised to do that if we need to pivot with our programs now. At this point, we still have been able to draw down money from Capital Projects Fund. At this point, we don't believe that the Capital Projects Fund, which is one of the ones we have in flight right now, is impacted. And then based on the clarifications that have come out following the executive order and the OMB memo, we believe that particularly the BEAD portion of the IIJA was not impacted. But again, we are still obviously awaiting federal guidance as well as things continue to evolve. But at this point, we don't believe that the program is impacted.
All right, thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your work. You and your office, people have the greatest things to say about you.
Well, thank you.
And, I just think back to when we were talking about 8 or 9 years ago, when right on this committee we had people, some of them aren't here anymore, but would ask about when they were going to get broadband in their areas. I think about Susan Holmes. She was always on us about it. And there was really nothing, common sense said it was going to take a lot of money, which it is. But even to have something set up, some kind of structure set up to handle money if it ever came in, we didn't have that. And you've just done an amazing job. And you're always, and members will talk about how they contact you and you give them information and work with them. And I really appreciate everything you do. I'm going to go back.
Thank you.
Maybe this weekend I'm going to watch the video of this and slow it down.
Sorry. I feel like we just have so much exciting information to share on this front that it's hard to slow down sometimes. But thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for coming very much. We appreciate
Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. I'm going to call upon Rhonda Chatham. There you are. Want to give us an update on what the independent telephone companies are doing?
Yes. Good afternoon. Do I just close this and then open mine? Okay. Okay. Good afternoon. I'm Rhonda Chatham, and I'm the Executive Director of the GTBA, which is Georgia's Rural Telephone and Broadband Association. And just happy to be here and give an update on behalf of our members and also share some slides. You have your packet there, but I also want to just share some good information that I feel like will be encouraging to those of you that are waiting on broadband. I always like to start out with our members, and there's a list there in your packet of each one of our members. And as I'll forgo reading them because there's 22 of them, but they are community-based providers. So if you look at that list and you see a name that you recognize, you know that they they do a really good job of being in their community and also, just providing great telephone and broadband service. And also the next slide is just our ILEC territory. Since we were first a telephone, we're a telephone organization and regulated in the telephone piece. Those are just the traditional ILEC telephones, much like how the power companies had their regulated territories. These were the telephone ones, and it's just good information. So the update that I wanted to give is back in 22, we did an update to this committee on kind of where we stood. Each one of the providers shared their information, and we poll our members each year kind of for an update, and we just recently did one. And as it stands right now, collectively, of those 22 members that we represent them and their subsidiaries, roughly 80% of our members' passings are fiber to the home. So, obviously when we had, legacy telephone, they've updated those copper lines and even some coax to fiber, but there are still some that are existing. But 90% of the association is above the underserved, over the 120, which would be a combination of fiber, coax, and a little bit of copper left. In 2022, our members passed roughly 192,000 locations, and that number is up to 361,000 right now based on the members. So we've kind of had about an 87, somewhere in there, percent growth of our association-wide. So our members are actively building. They are small companies, but they do build very quickly, and they serve, they try to serve everybody in their community that they're working with. And then in 2022, of the passings that we had, the 192,000, we actually provided service, and they call that the take rate. So, just because you pass a home doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to take the service. So in 2022, we had 131,612 locations that we had customers association-wide. And, that's a 68% take rate. So I always, kind of put a little thing in there that, people love our members. If we provide the service, generally speaking, people do try to take it, and they have great internet. But in 2024, we're now up to 206,000 locations that are served out of the 361 passings that we have, which is about a 57. So it's a little bit down. I don't necessarily have the information on why the take rate is down a little bit. It could be attributed to what Jessica was talking about. Some of these builds are in flight, so we may have the locations passed, but service may not be ultimately, turned up. They may not have the, software or something like that to actually provide the service. The next is, and I just always include this because this is where our members are. They're statewide, but as you can see, they're solely focused in rural areas and serving the communities that they do. And that's just a map for you to have in case you're want to check on an area and you have questions for me. And then the next thing that, I kind of wanted to talk about is just the impact for Helene. What was the broadband impacts for Hurricane Helene? We've been hearing a lot this legislature, especially on Hurricane Helene. And, all networks, they need power to operate for the most part. Even old legacy technology, you needed power. And so our members, much like the other ones in the room, we have generators that would operate their networks so that if a customer has power at their home, they're going to get service, if they have internet and they have telephone service primarily. But the good news for our members was during Hurricane Helene, and if you go back, and I'll just pan back, if you look at that map, you see there's a huge, heavy concentration in that southeast corridor of where Hurricane Helene was. And we did have a little bit of aerial that was impacted, but they were able to, keep supply on hand. Since we're carriers of last resort, they also have supplies on hand that they were able to put it back up really quickly. But most of our networks were buried. And so what that meant is, if the power companies were able to restore power, or they had a backup power source like a generator or something, they were able to have internet and phone service because our networks were buried and they're protected. And so I feel like that is very important as you're looking at legislation later. We have had several members, and I think it was, due to the fact that cell towers were down, communications were lost, things like that. So we do have a few members that have been reporting a rise in people saying, whoa, 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 I want my telephone back, So we do have had a rise, not a huge rise, but a rise in, landline phones back. So we had members that were awarded in ARPA and capital projects. And those grants were almost completed with those builds. We have a few that should be complete this first quarter of 2025. But other than that, most of our projects have been completed. I polled our members about BEAD. Jessica spent a great deal talking about BEAD, but we had 8 members that applied for BEAD, and I think that out of the 22, it seems kind of a low number, but I think it's actually a pretty high number. It was higher than I was expecting because the territory, remember, we're small community-based providers, and we only generally serve in the areas of where our networks are. And those areas are served, they've been served. And so, they're edging out into territories, not necessarily serving their areas that were unserved. And then another thing that I hope is okay with the committee, I just want to kind of give you some maps to show you kind of where we were, kind of what Chairman Dickey was talking about, where we were and kind of the light at the end of the tunnel. And I think that this is really good information. And the first map I want to show is on the left there in yellow. And of course, y'all's is black and white, but if you look on the screen in the yellow, that was where we were in 2021. And everything that's light yellow was unserved. And it was, pretty glim. And the dark yellow was anything that was 25.3 and above. And I'm sorry, but I always like to show that ILEC next to it because it matches up pretty close to where our members are. That was the dark yellow. So, even in the early years, they were already providing broadband service that was above the standard. And then the next slide it takes all 3 of those maps. So it takes the one where we started in 2021 before a lot of funding came out. And then you see the map that had a lot of the funding, and the dark yellow remained, but the other is just funding that you all were, working on. It was federal funding, but was y'all were working on it. And then all of the providers in the room, and you'll hear testimony from all of them. I think these maps right here show a testimony of how the providers can come together to solve a problem. We have members in our association that are partnering with some of the other providers. You have other providers that are partnering, and that's really what it took. Number one, it took the funding. Without the funding, we weren't going to necessarily get everything in rural Georgia served, but also the camaraderie and the working together with other providers that was able to complete it. And then that last map is where we are now. And so the maps have kind of changed over the time in that y'all passed some legislation that allowed for mapping to show anything above the 100/20 rather than the 25.3. So that hot pink area, and I know on the screen it may be hard to see and yours is black and white, but in the hot pink, that's anything above 100. It's no longer 25.3. That's anything that's above 120. And then the red dots are the ones that are the BEAD eligible locations. So there's not near as much. So I think that is just that's a good news for the state of Georgia. And then there it is with just where we started and at the end. So I think that, they say a picture's worth 1,000 words. I think that really shows that Georgia's in a much better place than it was a couple of years ago with broadband. And then those are just the same thing. I don't necessarily have to cover these, Chairman, if you don't want them covered, but these are just some things that I think that will be important to not only keep broadband in those areas, because these networks are, they need to be sustainable. You're going to, just as we've seen with Hurricane Helene, you've had fiber cuts, you've had outages, you need permits. There's a lot of things that will be in place to make sure not only that we get the broadband, but that we're able to keep it. And so these are just some things for you all to think about. And with that, that's really all I had on an update. Want to just thank you for allowing us to be here, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
I'll just ask you this.
Sure.
Traditionally, I know some of your organizations, some of the companies are part of that, and the co-ops, some are regulated by PSC, and some have chosen not to be.
Mm-hmm.
But traditionally, telephone companies had to provide service, basic telephone service to whoever's in the area that they had.
Mm-hmm. That's still the
And
case.
then but some were much more expensive to get to and
Yes.
maintain than others, but you were able, through a cost recovery type process,
Yes.
to be able to get that back. We have new members here, maybe some of the other members, but, this is also on internet. Maybe some people, if you would just kind of briefly tell us why it is that, and I know that some of the companies and co-ops in your organization did a lot for broadband even before this money came in, because they were reaching out and getting money from Department of Agriculture and FCC and different things. And I know a couple had done I'm sure they all did an amazing job, but some had covered a lot more area than others. But why is it, tell us why it is that when broadband came along and became an issue, why that these companies didn't, why is it so expensive? Why is it a problem to provide broadband to a lot of customers in these areas that you serve?
Well, so, think about, take yourself to a rural town, and as you're driving along, you go into the cities, and those look, they're somewhat populated. You'll have a store, you'll have a couple of houses, and you'll have, a restaurant, things like that. But when you get outside the inner city of those rural areas, you may drive 3 miles before, in between houses. And it costs just as much to serve from that one house to the next house as it does to serve 20 houses in between. And so when you can take, it's going to cost, and there's variations on how much it costs for a mile of fiber, but somewhere between, and it's a big range, but somewhere between 50 and 100,000, depending on what type of network you're building, and with inflation. But when it would cost the same amount to serve those 2 customers as it would here in metro area to serve 1,000, because you have a high rise with people in condos. So you have those 1,000 people dividing that number versus 2 people dividing that number. So that's the primary reason, and then also terrain. So you have various terrains. North Georgia has its issues, South Georgia has its issues on, weather type.
If those companies went to the PSC and said, we need to get our costs recovered for going way out there to grandma's house or whatever, would they have given you the money, provided the money somehow?
I mean, for broadband?
Yeah.
Broadband's not
That's
regulated.
right, okay. Well, that's one of the issues when we were doing those meetings, a lot of people just didn't, and I'm sure some still don't get it. I mean, just didn't understand why it's a telephone company and they provide telephone service. Why aren't they doing this? Why aren't they?
And I think it's important, also for our members. I hear oftentimes, especially in some of the southeast areas that are growing a lot, if it's an area that has a high impact right now with some of the economic growth, they're concerned because they still have that regulated piece where they have a carrier of last resort. And if someone applies for a telephone in their regulated territory, they are under obligation to provide that telephone no matter what. So, you only have a certain amount of supplies that you can do. And so some of them were hesitant on edging out of their territories because they wanted to make sure with the high growth that they were able to still provide for the people that were moving in for homes and such.
Well, thank you very much
Yes.
for the information. We appreciate it very much. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
I don't see any other questions right now, I don't think. I don't see any. Okay.
Okay.
All right, we have, I know AT&T has some information for us, the EMCs, cable television, and who else? Another telephone company. But of the people that have asked, I think there's only one I know of that might have little children at home waiting for her, so I'm going to call upon AT&T.
I will gladly take that exception. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Elizabeth Reynolds. I'm State Director of Legislative Affairs for AT&T, and I will be brief. I know we have a lot of other presenters this morning or this afternoon, but thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you and to share a little bit about the broadband story. As you heard from Jessica and Rhonda, it is a really positive story. And I think that's a testament to the legislature and the work of this committee in particular. So thank you for your leadership and your continued focus on this issue. And Chairman, want to publicly echo your comments to Jessica. Her and her team are just absolutely incredible to work with. So thank you very much for all that y'all do. So when people are asking, what's AT&T up to these days, the very short answer is broadband. But when I say broadband, I don't just mean the product that's going
out to people's homes and businesses, it's also the whole broadband ecosystem that goes along with that. So accessibility for the product, and then also affordability of the product. In the last 5 years alone, AT&T has invested nearly $14.9 billion, and that's our own private capital, in our networks in Georgia. We now have more than 6.7 million miles of AT&T fiber around the state, which, if you're a visual person like me, that's the equivalent of going to the moon and back 14 times with the amount of fiber we have in Georgia. And that translates into now more than 1.8 million Georgia homes and businesses that have access to fiber, and that's across more than 130 communities around our state, and it's continuing to grow. Beyond just the fiber product, as I said, it's also important to address accessibility. So since 2021, we've distributed more than 5,000 laptops, more than 2,700 Wi-Fi hotspots to families across Georgia, and that's from Bartow to Glasscock to Atlanta to Waycross and many communities in between. We've opened 6 AT&T Connected Learning Centers, and these are essentially computer labs. They're high-speed internet access, computers, educational resources, and it's a place for people in the community to go to do homework or apply for a job. We've contributed more than $3.4 million to Georgia Digital Divide efforts since 2021, and we've also supported more than 125 digital literacy workshops. And so those trainings that are available around the state, there are 2 main focuses. One, it's helping people that are maybe not as comfortable operating in today's modern workforce environment, but it's also training for parents, so they feel more comfortable making decisions for their families about how to navigate safely online in the world that we live in today, and I definitely need to take advantage of those as well. And then finally, the affordability piece, we have our Access from AT&T program that offers high-speed internet for $30 a month for qualifying households. We have a long history of operating in Georgia, and we're very proud of our tradition and look forward to continuing on that. We did participate in the BEAD program that Jessica spoke about today, and I'm sure, like many others in the room, are very eagerly awaiting the results of that program. But we also understand that while we might be in competition with other providers in the marketplace, when it comes to rural broadband, it does take all of us, as Rhonda alluded to. And I think that you've seen that here in Georgia, that every provider, we've worked together, we come together, we all have a seat at the table, and I think you'll continue to see that, and that's why we're in such a great place today. So thank you. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Remind me and tell us, where is AT&T located across the state? I'm sure, do you have a map or anything that
I
shows
don't
it?
have a map, Mr. Chairman, but I'd be happy to get that to you and distribute to the committee later on.
I guess I think of AT&T different. There are still places in the state that AT&T is like the incumbent telephone company.
Yes,
is that
sir.
correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, but I'll get a map and we'll share it with the
I'm
committee.
just curious. Okay. I don't see any questions. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
I think the next person to ask me about it was probably the EMCs. I think
Yes,
it's
sir.
Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Jason Bragg from Georgia, representing Georgia EMC. We represent the state's 41 electric membership cooperatives, EMCs. Obviously, you guys in the Energy Utilities Committee know that our primary job is to provide electricity. However, we've kind of entered into this broadband space thanks to some legislation passed by the legislature and some of the work done by this committee a few years ago that the chairman alluded to. When we started down this path back around 2016, I know the chairman mentioned the joint study committee that the Senate did. It's hard to believe it's been that long ago, but we had only 2 members. And I should say, I'm sorry, we have a map. You have a map in front of you of all of our EMC broadband projects along with a slide. The map is this one, just so you can see it. This lists all of our projects along with an overlaid with the state's original broadband map that shows unserved and served areas, so you can see where those projects are, and then a little slide that has some of the highlights I'm going to take here. But when we started down this, we had 2 EMCs up in northeast Georgia, Habersham and Blue Ridge Mountain EMC, which are in green there, that decided to take the leap into the broadband business. They saw a need in their community, went ahead and did that. As the legislature moved on to talk about this subject more, our members saw a need for statutory clarity, and this committee passed Senate Bill 2 in 2019, which was passed by the House, Senate, led by the late Representative Jay Powell and Senator Gooch over in the Senate. That bill was signed into law in 2019 and authorized our EMCs to provide broadband-related services. Under the bill, we currently, as I said right now, we have 25 of our state's 41 EMCs offering some form of broadband. 7 of those are through the affiliate model, which was authorized under Senate Bill 2, which provides where the EMC actually owns the broadband provider. It is a fully owned subsidiary that is subject to cross-subsidization provisions that are monitored and regulated by the Public Service Commission over across the street. The other 18 projects are partnerships or other infrastructure sharing agreements with a third party who is the actual ISP providing the service at the end of the line. This model has been really great for our members. It's given us flexibility because, as you'll remember, Mr. Chairman, from when we had a lot of discussions on how to roll out broadband in the state, you had different needs in different areas. The structure through Senate Bill 2 allows us a lot of flexibility to design projects, whether it's the affiliate model that I mentioned or working with other partners. I know Rhonda mentioned we have a project up in LJ with ETC, which is one of her members, also another one down on the coast with Darien Telephone, also ones with Connexon, Windstream in Middle Georgia, True Vista in Northeast Georgia. And so it's really opened up the door for some of these partnerships that have really helped bring broadband to rural Georgia, and it's something we're very proud of. Every year we survey our members. We do that survey in July with the most latest data that we have on our EMC-related broadband projects. Currently, right now, based off the data we have, there are over 80,000 subscribers to an EMC broadband project, and we currently pass about a little over 267,000 locations and businesses that service can be offered to. Through that, we've also built about 28,000 miles of fiber. Elizabeth said the visual learning, so I looked it up really quickly. That's one circumnavigation of the globe, plus probably another trip out to L.A. So I know that I looked that up really quickly. That was a good little trick that she did. But we've built over 28,000 miles of fiber with a planned investment when all these projects are built out that have been announced of over about $1 billion. These are primarily fiber-based projects that can deliver symmetrical multi-gig speed to rural areas that in many cases did not have those. We have some EMCs, such as Washington EMC in Sandersville, Central Georgia EMC down in Jackson, Southern Rivers Energy in Barnesville, Middle Georgia EMC in Vienna, that have built out their entire electric network, that have completed their build. Most of those projects are currently working with Connexon Connect. You see on your sheet some of the partners and some of the affiliate names that our broadband projects are going under throughout the state. But those members in those EMC territories are fully built out. We have others that are probably nearing completion, since a lot of those were announced right around 2020, 2021, 2022. You heard a great update from Jessica on the state's grant programs that have been run. Our EMCs have participated in those. Every one that the state has run, ARP. We have EMCs that have applied for BEAD. We've also participated in other federal programs, USDA Reconnect, which was authorized to the Department of Agriculture, and also RDOF, which was the RDOF auction that the FCC did a few years back. In closing, I'll just close with just saying thank you to this committee and thank you to this body for the work that you've done on this. Representative Dickey mentioned the progress that we've made. This has really been a team sport. We don't see ourselves, and we always said this when we were up here testifying. I know I testified a number of times on Senate Bill 2. We're not the silver bullet to this solution, but we want to help be part of the solution and try to bring that service to our communities. And I think that the progress that you're seeing amongst all providers is really encouraging, and it's something that our members are really proud to be part of that solution and appreciate the legislature's trust in us to allow us to enter in those markets. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. I don't see any questions. I appreciate all the work that y'all do and the efforts you put into this. I've always thought, I think back going to when we had our study committee, I always thought, and I mentioned it then, that I've always thought the AMCs were well positioned to be part of the part of the solution because of the footprint that you have, and you already have poles and strands out there between the poles to get to different places. I always thought that. If you recall, one of my issues was, and we passed the bill, that bill you referred to, Senate Bill 2, I think it was, out a different way, and then it was changed when it got finally to the floor. And that was, I always thought, and I still think, that the EMC should only serve, however, that they should only serve and get this money to serve areas that are non-served, and the bill was passed so that you could go into a served area too. How do you think that is played out? I mean, I'm hoping you're going to say that y'all are just sticking to the non-served areas because that only makes sense, but I know that the EMCs were adamant that they would be included, that the bill would be written so that you go into served areas, which never made any sense to me. Why would we want you to do that? So do you think that you go into served areas very often, or do you think it's mostly non-served?
If you look at our map that we have here that overlays some of these projects, obviously this is not a network map. This is just for the locations of where these EMCs are and where the unserved areas. I mean, you can look at this and see the vast area that is unserved. Yeah. Obviously, if you're building out to every person on your service territory, there are likely going to be some areas that are served. Most of the ones that have committed to projects, particularly the ones in Middle Georgia, obviously the unserved areas were the ones that they wanted to get to first, and they tried to do that. We do have other EMCs that are working with projects, particularly with partners, to serve areas of their locations that weren't served. A lot of those are partnerships, and they're trying to focus on those unserved areas of their service territory, particularly some of the ones around Metro Atlanta that may have large areas closer to Atlanta that are served and some away from that are not. And on that same note, Mr. Chairman, we've also seen some situations, particularly, as broadband's been rolled out, there may be areas and territories that are on the edge of some of these EMCs that may either be in another EMC's territory, may even be in Georgia Power service territory for electric side. And our members are trying to look at opportunities to serve those places because those are ones that kind of get left out sometimes.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure in some cases, once the broadband is deployed in certain areas, then the EMCs can use that for monitoring the service on the areas that goes to, not just for providing it to customers, broadband customers, but that's also used for all the different things that you have data going back and forth on. And I appreciate that. I mean, I'm not trying to argue with you at all. It's all said and done a long time ago.
That's okay.
But and I know that there's at least one EMC, I won't mention a name, but they've told me that they're doing, that they've apparently provided quite a bit of broadband, but they're not doing it without any of the money come from Washington. I don't know exactly how, but I mean, they're very proud of that, and I congratulate them for it. But I do appreciate, obviously I appreciate the EMCs very much and all that you do, and you've always had a place in this thing, a very important part of it, because of the footprint and all the good work and all the good service that you provide, and I appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I don't see any other questions. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it.
All right. Let's see. Next, we have a Windstream.
Thank you.
Another big player in the state of Georgia.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I'll be brief, and I know that folks that we partner with have made some comments too, so I don't want to be duplicative. But Windstream Kinetic is the product that provides broadband. We are the second largest ILEC, which is the incumbent telephone provider in Georgia. And as several of our telecom partners have said, that has spun out in the past 20 years into a broadband provider that has been great really over the past 5 years as we prosper in these rural areas and grow. Like Jason Bragg said, that we've had some great partnerships with the folks at the EMCs, and how those work is, if we know how to hang fiber and they have poles and they have a great customer base, then sometimes you can come together and do those things better. Some of that is local money that is put together when you have all these applications for these different programs that were described by Jessica, who's been an incredible partner, and the way she described that, gosh, we're just not sure what's coming next. The only reason that we feel comfortable with that is because we really haven't known how things were going to go for the past 6 years, but they've just figured it out every time. That we are on the 5th round of funding that has come through in one program or another that the state has helped implement, even though it's come from the feds. And there are people from all over Georgia, the country, who ask, how was Georgia able to jump on this so quick? And that's because of what you guys did back in 2017 when you created the map. We had the map way before anybody else. We knew what was served, what was underserved, and we were able to jump right on that with partners. So that was it. There was a woman named Dina Perry who was over at the Department of Community Affairs who did that, and for the past 4 years she has run state affairs for Windstream. She is not able to be with us today, but she really spearheaded so much of this and has been so much part of our success. So we're great to have that. It's 300,000 households in rural Georgia that have received gig service over the past 5 years. We had a very aggressive plan in 2024, not only with grant money, but also with private investment. We would be remiss if we didn't mention Helene, which was tough. The cell towers, which Rhonda mentioned, that was devastating to those folks because you take that for granted. That cell service that you've had for the past 10 years, and when that goes away, and you say, well, gosh, Windstream is just a broadband company, and they just do landlines. They don't have a cell service, but the fiber that we run goes directly into a lot of those towers. So really, this has given us the opportunity to work more with the power companies, with the cellular companies, with the Verizons and the AT&Ts who have pieces of that, and say, what can we do better for next time? It's been a good, learning moment on that. We have had 4,000 miles over 60 counties of fiber that was laid just last year. In addition to the private funded phones builds, it's our intent to wrap up on that first round, those ARPA funds, a year early. With 18 counties, and that will be 80,000 locations, which you say, well, in Gwinnett County, that doesn't sound like a lot, but Windstream operates in 110 counties in Georgia of 159. So, we're not in Augusta or in Fulton, but we're certainly in Webster County and Dade County and places like that where it may not be as dense, but the needs are just as dire for those folks. So, with that, we can answer any questions, but we just feel really privileged to be able to serve people in Georgia. We think that it has been great, what was set up through, the mapping projects, and then, SB2 that came the year after that it really has built the telecom community that was seen in competition with each other for years and years, has really seen a lot of partnership in the 5 years since then. So. Last thing I want to add is, Jessica has a team of 3, I believe, at this point. When they stood up this program in Virginia, which is similar to population, they had 40 people, and they didn't know where to start. So if you wonder, are we getting our bang for our buck? Yeah, big time.
Thank you. I've got a question for you. I know
Yes, sir.
It's getting late and we need to move on, but I do want to ask, I could ask any of the presenters this, but, I was thinking about how we did. And I really haven't had any, calls or anything, or emails, letters now for a long time about, what can you do to get us broadband service here in the state. And I think part of it is because, there has been a lot done. A lot of places didn't have it a few years ago, has it now? But I'm also wondering if, the cellular service hasn't supplanted that in a lot of areas where people, I know I do a lot of stuff on my cell phone. Google and now ChatGPT and things like that. I mean, I think that has to play into it. A lot of people are just using their cellular service on their phones instead of doing things on their laptops and iPads. I mean, what do you think about that?
I think that's a piece of it, but like I said, that broadband and the fiber that we lay is critical to that. So I think that comes into it too. Also, I think that COVID was it laid everything bare to a degree, that we saw that, while phones are great and they were working in most places, that we weren't able to put our kids into school with their phones, that you really needed that, fiber connectivity. There were folks that were, they were parking and the, McDonald's parking lots because they couldn't get on. So I think that while we're talking about, just general connectivity, looking for traffic updates or weather or things like that, that it's absolutely great, with your phone. But I think that we also saw that there does need to be that fiber connectivity component too. So I think that 10 years ago, it wasn't as good as it is now, and 10 years from now, I think it will be significantly increased, and all those will be elevated.
Okay. I just wanted to ask. Thank you very much. I appreciate
you.
you coming. Oh, I'm sorry. We have a question.
Oh, it's me.
Oh,
It's not just a comment, I will say that especially as technology continues to make its way into our lives, I've noticed that even with farmers like my dad will use internet to upload like large data sets or something like that for his, livestock, or he's trying to track vendors or needs to get on a call for Zoom. So one of those places, he's in Elberton now. So just want to say to everyone that's here, that's much appreciated, because he has talked about sort of the impact that would have on a business like his. So thank you.
thank you very much. I
Thank you.
appreciate it. We have one more presenter, Hunter Hopkins, Cable Association.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Hunter Hopkins with the Georgia Cable Association. We're made up of 5 members, Comcast, Charter, Mediacom, Cox Communications, and Vive Broadband. And together, our 5 member companies, we serve 2.1 million broadband customers here in the state of Georgia, currently in 129 counties. For the most part, the bulk of broadband expansion projects have always been self-funded by our companies. It's private capital that's going in. There have been some federal funds, federal opportunities out there. Somebody mentioned it earlier, talking about RDOF and USDA Reconnect and other stuff. But it wasn't until COVID hit and the pandemic and everybody was at home when you've seen all this other funding that Ms. Simmons was talking about. But I just want to hit a couple high points with some of these programs. With the RDOF, with that program, our member companies, we were awarded $30.4 million to serve almost 26,000 locations in 36 counties across the state. With the ARPA program, we were awarded just over $16 million to serve almost 10,000 locations in 7 counties. And in the Capital Projects Fund, we were awarded over $153 million to serve over 56,000 locations in 17 counties across the state. Once all these projects are completed, our footprint will actually increase, adding 2 counties. So we'll have service by cable providers in 131 out of Georgia's 159 counties. We're actively, a number of my members have applied for these the BEAD program. Due to where we are in that stage, we won't know until we hear back from the broadband office and the federal government on that. But hopefully, we look to put on to hopefully win a number of those grants and expand our footprint even further. One fortunate thing about cable networks is, traditionally, most of our lines are the coaxial lines. It's been like that for a number of years. Those lines have the capability to carry a higher speed of broadband service. All the new lines that we're putting into the ground right now are all fiber, which is almost unlimited in the amount of speeds. But we've got some of our member companies are working on new technologies and stuff like that, eventually to get to a 10 gig speed. I know most of us have been talking about, 100 megabits per second. Some of the requirements are 100 up and, 20 down. We're talking a gig is 1,000. And then the 10G is going all the way up to, 10 of those. So, Chairman Parsons, it's kind of hard to fathom, but Chairman Parsons, you kind of mentioned that you just upped your speeds at home because your grandson can play on his games. But there, as more people, as technology is advancing and there's more online, social interaction, online gaming. My 12-year-old's, big into that stuff too. There's the telehealth. You can literally get online from your home and sit there and have a clear conversation over your computer screen with your, your medical provider. We're working on strengthening our networks and increasing our reliability and our speed so that eventually everybody here in the state of Georgia, will be able to enjoy all these technological benefits of high-speed broadband. So I know that was brief, but a lot of the points were made by previous speakers, and I know you're ready to get home and start heading north.
He prayed for it to be, well, we did not answer his.
But I appreciate the opportunity to share that information with you.
No,
So
thank you. I appreciate you coming. I appreciate the presenters. It's a complex issue, especially, as far as, the issue is complex. Providing broadband service is complex enough, but then the different funding streams and things like that. The thing is, that I'm happy about, is those funding streams are there, and that they're being used, and we're getting broadband service out there. It's late, I'm not going to give my broadband speech, but I've always felt very sorry for people in the state. In a way, sometimes they're actually blessed not to have it, but in general, I always felt sorry that they didn't have broadband. It just to do the things that we do on an everyday basis. Using Google and now AI and things like that. So I appreciate everything that's being done. I appreciate members of the committee that have stayed in here. Next week we'll have some legislation. I have some legislation I was going to sign to subcommittee today, but we'll move on from that. I can do that. It doesn't have to be done in the meeting, so we can next week we'll have some legislation to take up. And I think it's been some good information brought here today. I appreciate it very much. Anybody have anything for the good of the order before we adjourn? If not, we are adjourned.